Hi there, this is Carl Irwin with another Blender tutorial. It's been a long time since we've done a Blender tutorial that's just for Blender. So this is going to be a Blender tutorial that's just for Blender's sake. We're actually going to deal in tracking today, and I've not really dealt with tracking too much in the past. And I've had an idea for a long time that I've never really seen used well, and I haven't really seen implemented well in Blender. I've seen it in 2.5D or 3D compositors, but not in Blender, not in the viewport, not in a scene. I've seen some things like this in the compositor using the planar tracking, but that's kind of a different concept here. I want to be able to get a shot that looks something like this. You can see we have this boat here, this kind of dilapidated boat, sitting in some churning water. And if I just play the video, you can see the concept here. So the camera zooms out, and you can see that the boat is sitting at the edge of a giant waterfall. This is obviously Niagara Falls. And the idea here is that the camera movement on this shot is a three-dimensional camera move. It is not a two-dimensional nodal motion. That is, it is not on a tripod just panning up or down. Whenever you have a two-dimensional nodal sort of fixed point fulcrum-based camera movement, you can do what's known as two-point tracking. You can track 2 points in your footage, and then you can parent assets to those 2 points, and those 2 points can account for rotation and location on just a 2-point kind of lineup of assets. And the assets don't have to exist in 3D space because the camera does not generate any parallax motion. It's not moving forward or backward in Z space. This camera shot, however, does. You can see that the camera is actually moving in and out of Z space. It's actually quite a drastic move. Never mind the camera zoom there, but the camera itself is moving quite a bit. And you see a parallax motion between the boat and the actual water surface right back here. My thought on this was, what if you were able to do this in certain circumstances where you would only need to track 1 or 2 points, and you were able to parent a card with an image on it? So this is not a 3D model here. It's just a picture, just an image, a flat card. If I could parent that such that the base of it, the place where it makes contact with the presumed geometry in the scene, could stick. However, the geometry or the presumed geometry that is not making contact would be able to stay in a fixed point in space and allow for parallax motion, right? And the concept here is kind of like what you can do with planar tracking in some 2.5D compositors, where you can do a planar track, that is to select an area and have that footage tracked and then put an object on a point on that planar track at its surface and allow just that point of that card to stick while the rest of the card can kind of change in parallax motion with the scene. Hopefully this makes sense as we go ahead. But this is an extremely valuable trick, because it allows you then to do a very complex camera motion tracking without doing complex camera tracking. It's very easy to do a 2-point manual track if you really had to. If you had 2 points that are not necessarily very good tracking points, but you could manually go through them, for 100, 200 frames, that's not a whole lot of work really to do that, to do just 2 points in that manner, to get your 2 points tracked out and then tie something between them. You could do just a very little bit of work on 2 points and then assign a card to that in very specific circumstances, and get away with a lot, I think, in a lot of different sorts of environments that would be acceptable to do that. So a couple of things to notice about the flaws. This is not perfect because our boat is not real geometry. So you notice there's no parallax motion on the boat itself with itself. However, I think that doesn't get noticed because of the greater scheme. So that's generally the way 2.5D compositing works, is that you're dealing with flat two-dimensional surfaces that are parallax in parallax motion with each other, but on those cards, you don't necessarily see motion between. So you want to limit your camera moves when you're doing that kind of compositing. Anyway, we're going to do all this in the viewport, and we're going to be able to render directly from the viewport, including the water assets that are on there. I think I would have composited these water assets a little bit differently. We'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. But grab a cup of coffee. This will be a nice long tutorial where we'll look at all the details of this particular shot and ways to do a 2-point track where we are compositing into a Z space camera motion. Very, very interesting little technique here. So let's get started. I have found that Blender 2.8 is still lagging quite a bit in terms of speed on computers that are using just CPU rendering. In particular, the video sequence editor is remarkably slow right now. I'm finding that the video sequence editor does not render nearly as fast as 2.79. So I'm doing a lot of my video editing still in 2.79. I'm doing some scene viewport rendering still in 2.79. But I'm really trying hard to get over here to 2.8 because this is the way of the future. So hopefully some of those things will get updated, upgraded, and refined as time goes on, and we'll get our speed back. For the most part, however, what we're going to be doing in the scene space, we'll render very, very quickly. We can render using Eevee. You know that on this channel, I like to render from the viewport using OpenGL. I think that now can include Eevee rendering as well, where we get a few extra little perks with that, like a camera motion blur and things like that that we couldn't get before. However, you still have the ability to render OpenGL without using Eevee as well. So we'll look at both of those when we get to that point. All right, so the first thing we want to do is get rid of the default stuff in here. We're going to get rid of our cube. We don't need that. Everything's going to be shadeless in this scene. We're doing a 2.5D composite of shadeless images, so we're not going to need lighting, which makes our rendering very, very quick. Let's go to the top view. So we're going to go to the viewpoint at the top, and then I'm going to align the active camera to that view just to start out. The next thing we're going to do is we need to track some footage. So let's go to the tracking. We're going to hit the plus sign over here, go down to VFX, and click on motion tracking. And we're going to open up a video clip. So let's open up a clip, and we'll go to our assets here. I got this footage of Niagara Falls off of Pixabay. I've found that to be a very good resource. I got the image also of the boat on Pixabay. So things you're going to need. You're going to need an image of a boat. And I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to tell you that I did it. I went through and I cut out everything I didn't need in GIMP. And I masked this out just using the trace tool to get an alpha transparent background there on the boat. So you're going to need that. And then also I have my footage here of Niagara Falls. This is what the footage looks like, again from Pixabay. So it's actually a fairly steady drone shot, and you can see how far in Z space it's moving. We're not going to use all of the footage because we get a little bit of occlusion there with the mist, and we don't want to have to deal with that. There are ways to do that, but we don't want to have to deal with that. So we're going to cut this short for the purposes of our shot. So you'll need those two things. Let's grab our Niagara Falls footage and open that up. I found that this shot kind of ended best at about 180, so I'm just going to put that in right now for the end point. And we'll play it through just to see that everything's in there and also cache in to our memory. And what we're going to do now is we're going to pick 2 points to track that are on the kind of the same plane where we're going to place our boat, or the card that represents our boat, flat image. And we want this to be at the base of where the boat is at. So we're going to pick points on the water. Now, the interesting thing here is that the conventional wisdom is that if you were doing a 3D track of this shot, this would be a nightmare, really, because of all of the movement that's going on there. You couldn't just do a planar track of that. If you wanted to, and you couldn't really do, a lot of, you would not be able to just add trackers by detecting features in this. It wouldn't give you a lot of good results. You would have to manually pick points and be very, very picky about it, and you need to pick quite a few points to get a good track. We're just going to track 2 points, so we only need 2 fixed points that don't really move a lot. So let's take a look at this. We're going to put our boat kind of in this area right here. I'm keying in on these 2 right here. There's a rock over there and one over there. Now, as points, they aren't that great because they do morph and change. However, there's enough there in pixel data that it stays in the same spot. So let's do that. I'm going to track this point right here. So I'm going to go back to the beginning. And I'm going to set my tracking settings here to be blurry footage so that the trackers are large. And I'm going to add a tracker right here on this rock. Just like that. I'm going to make it pretty big. So we'll just zoom that out. Then I'm going to add another one right over here on this spot. So we'll add another tracker in that spot right here. Now, normally doing this, I would go through and I would probably manually track to get a really, really good solve. If I get a little bit of floating, I'm not going to worry about it for the purposes of this tutorial, just to demonstrate what's going on. But you would probably want to go in, and if you're only going to use 2 points, you might as well do it right? So I would probably manually track these through frame by frame just to be sure. But for right now, let's just see what we get here if I track these right from the start. So we'll go down here to the tracker itself, and we'll just hit the forward button and see what we get. So you can see that we have some sliding going on over here. If I play this back in real time, just to watch it kind of closely, that's pretty wobbly. You know what? We're just going to do it. Let's do it. Let's just track this sucker all the way through. All right, so this is the payoff here, right? It's worth it. It's worth it, though. Let's take this one here. We're going to track ahead one, frame by frame. And as we see it starting to slide out, we'll just slide it back a little bit. Okay, so I think we have it now, and you can see that was a little painstaking on one track there. Can you imagine what it would be like to have to manually track for a 3D track? So this is we're saving quite a bit of time by doing it this way, but I think we're good to go. We've got two relatively good tracks, not a lot of sliding going around. Okay, let's then take these two tracks, or make sure that we have them both selected, and we're going to go to the solve. We're going to click on geometry. We're going to do link empty to track. So what that will do is now if we go back to our layout, you'll see now that we have two empties that are in there that should track with our camera to our 2 points. You can see that they're scaling closer together. So we have now geometry in the scene that will line up with this. And this is just on the grid. It's sitting right on the grid in 2D space. As long as our camera doesn't move, that will stay right in that spot, and anything we put around it will be associated with it as well. So let's go back here to the camera view, and let's set this up for a kind of traditional 2D tracking parenting. Before I do that, though, just so that we can kind of see what's going on in the background, you can use on the camera a background image. If we go to the camera and then set up our background images here, you can load in the video. So we'll go to this video of Niagara Falls that we had. I think it's this one right here. And we're just going to use the first 180 frames of it because that's what we are set up for. And if we put that in there and we turn up the alpha, there we go, set to back, we can see that everything parents well. Now, something changed, however, in Blender 2.8 where we can't really render from the viewport using the background images. That's just as well. It's probably better to put this actually on geometry, and that's what we're going to do in a second. But you'll notice here that when we turn off any things that are unwanted in render, we lose our background image. So that's a difference from the previous versions. I'm just going to turn this off, however, for the moment, and turn off the background image. I'm going to add a plane. So we'll add a plane here very quickly and scale it up so it fills out our frame. I'm just going to move it back in Z space a little bit so that it is back behind everything, not sitting right on the grid, but just sitting behind it. We'll go back to our camera view. And I'm going to tab into edit mode and go to edges. I'm going to subdivide this just a couple times to give us a little bit of a head start for camera projection. And from here I'm going to go to UV and I'm going to hit project from view. Tab out of edit mode. And then I'm going to go to the shader here and I'm going to click on new. And we want to use nodes for this. I'm also going to go to Eevee so that we can see what's going on. And slide this up. On our shader, we're actually just going to add the video texture. So we'll add texture. Now there is, and we'll add an image texture here, there actually is a shader for shadeless textures, but I found that it's not necessary most of the time. You can just put the texture directly into the material slot and that works well. So that's what we're going to do. We'll select our Niagara Falls footage, open that up. It is a movie. We're going to use 180 frames of it. And I'm just going to take the color out of this and drop it into the surface, and I'll just move my principal BSDF over here. I'm not going to need that. Now we see our footage. So when I play this back, let's go back over here, make sure that this is set. We want this to auto-refresh. When we play this back, we'll see that our footage moves and our trackers sit with the footage. And as long as our camera does not move, everything that we put in here will stay on these trackers, will stay associated with that footage, and we'll parent very cleanly to it. So far, so good. So we've got our 2 points, we've got our footage, we're able to render now, and now if I turn off all of my peripheral elements there, I can render directly from here if I want to using Eevee, or I can render from here using the viewport render, and it renders extremely fast. So we're all set to do a good 2.5D composite. Okay, so now if you're familiar with the next steps here, you'll know in 2-point tracking, 2-point 2D tracking, you know that we're going to need to add a bone to this. So we're going to place a bone on one of these empties, and then it's going to stretch to the other empty and give us some geometry in our image here that will sit on this particular plane between these 2 points, and will stick there. Now, traditionally when we do this, we're dealing with just location and rotation because it's a nodal camera move. It's a panning camera move, and there's no scaling going on. What we're doing is we're taking that same concept and we're putting it into 3D space, so that as these 2 points change scale to each other, that bone will essentially inherit the space between the 2 points in 3-dimensional space, at least in terms of the camera perspective. So something that was flat and sitting in that place like a billboard, right, a card, in terms of 2.5D compositing, that would be able to stick at the base to that spot, and would provide us with what would appear to be parallax motion on the areas that are not stuck to that exact point. So let's see what we can do. And this has a lot of implications for various types of scenes too. You could create a hole, theoretically in something, and parent the inside of that hole on a couple of cards to an empty, and be looking down through a planar tracked, corner pinned surface, right? And it should give you the illusion of a 3-dimensionally tracked hole with geometry underneath it. There's a lot of ways that you could apply this potentially, that under the right circumstances with not a really deep camera move, you could very quickly chop together a convincing scene that looks like a 3-dimensional camera projection and CG geometry kind of shot. So let's get to it here. Let's select the first tracker over here. And what we want to do is we're going to parent, and actually let's go back and make sure we're at the beginning. We're going to snap our cursor to that empty, and then we're going to add to this an armature, add a bone. And we want to kind of pay attention to what's going on here, because we're going to add another bone a little bit later that's going to be rotated, and it will be rotated in relationship to this one. It'll make sense when we get there. So right now the bone is looking at us, so we're looking down in Z space at the top of the bone if we come out of the perspective, you can see that it's right there. And what we want to do is we want to parent this bone to that track. So this is the empty right here. We're going to parent the armature to the first track. So we'll select that one. We'll go up to Object, and we're going to select Parent. And we'll parent it to that. The next thing we want to do here is go to our second track, and we'll kind of follow the same procedure. We're going to snap the cursor to that area, go back to our bone, and we're going to enter into its pose mode. So the armature pose mode. And we're going to tab, and then we're going to move this object, this end of the bone, to that space. So we'll go up to Armature, and we're going to hit Snap Selection to Cursor. So that then elongates and enlarges our bone and puts it into that spot. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to add a constraint to this. So in pose mode, we're going to go to the Bone Constraints tab down here. I'm going to add a constraint to stretch to. Again, this is old school stuff, 2D tracking. If you've ever done it in Blender, this is the way we've done it for a long time. Whenever you're putting, a card or something in 2D space on a 2-point track, we want this to stretch to the track number 1. And the rest of this doesn't really matter. There's some indications for volume variation. Now, I've played around a lot with these settings, and I found that these settings don't really help us with what we're trying to do. It's just aggravating because it seems like the setting should be doing things that it doesn't necessarily do. The goal here with these settings is that it would maintain or allow deformation of the volume as the bone stretches. Now, normally that would make sense if we were trying to get everything to scale uniformly, but again, we're dealing with volume, not scale. And if the volume is changing, then the scale doesn't really change. And that's the problem with this technique, just using one bone. What we're going to need to do is we're going to need to parent an additional bone to this that will give us the scale on the y-axis so that we can use that information on our card. So let me explain and show you how that works. Right now, if we play this back, we should see that this bone will now scale, at least in volume variation, with our 2 points. Okay, so any card that we would parent to this will do the same thing, but it will compress on the x-axis and it will stay the same on the y-axis. It's that y scale that we need to try to get. So here's how we're going to do it. Before we do that, though, let's go out of pose mode and let's deal with what we're looking at here in the armature. We want this to look a little bit different. Instead of an octahedral, let's just make this a stick so it's a little bit easier to see what's going on in here. The next thing I want to do is I want to find the point directly between these two on this stick bone. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to select the first track, I'm going to select the second track, and then I'm going to move my cursor, snap cursor to selected. That's what we want. So now we have our cursor in the middle of those 2 objects. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add another bone right here. So we're going to add another armature. You see that the bone is sitting like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to parent this bone to the first bone. So we'll select our bone here, and then we're going to select our second armature, and then we're going to go to Object Parent, and we're going to select Parent Bone. So now we have one bone parented to the second one, and if we play this back, you'll see that that now moves in tandem with the first one, but you'll notice that its length does not change, just its width. See how this is working. So what we want to do is we want to get this so that it is sitting upright to this first bone, but we want it to also inherit the rotation of that bone. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply a couple of constraints to this bone right here. I'm going to add a constraint to my second bone. Let's make sure we just have that one, our second one, selected here. Constraints. And I'm going to add a copy rotation constraint to that, and we're going to select the first armature as the designator here. So what that will do is that will allow this to pick up the X, Y, and Z rotation of this bone. We don't really need the X and the Y. What we need is just the Z. Okay, so we need the Z space. Now you'll notice that our bone is facing the wrong way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this oriented properly. I'm going to disable very quickly my constraint so I can see. And you'll notice that it moves. When I enable that, you can see how it picks up the Z rotation. I want this to be facing upright. So I'm going to rotate this on the X-axis -90 degrees. And then I'm going to go to the up here to the apply, and I want to apply the new rotation. So now when I enable this, we can see that we're a little off. So that wasn't quite right. You can see how it's wrong. So let's figure out which way we want this to go. I want this to rotate. We're going to do another rotation here. We're going to rotate our Z -90. Escape. RZ 90. There we go. Enter, and we'll go up here again to Object, Apply, Rotation. Now let's see if we're in the right orientation. So now we're good. So when we enable this, now that we've applied our rotation, if you look back here from our camera view, you can see that we have our bone is sitting in the right space. You'll also notice something new. Because we've applied our rotation, notice how the bone is transforming. The bone is actually picking up the appropriate Y scale. So as our first bone is changing scale on the X-axis, our bone that is parented to it, because we've applied rotation, is now inheriting that exact same scale end for end. So what we have here is an area that is scaling properly when we take into account the first bone and the second bone. And now we have all the information we need. Let's make this a little bit easier to tolerate. We'll go to our second armature, and we'll go to our view here, and we're going to display this as a stick as well. So now I've got my rig set up. Now we can apply a card to this in such a way that we can apply scale on the X and the Y axis. Okay, let's do that very quickly. So we already have our cursor set in the right spot. We're actually going to parent to this location. Let's add very quickly our image, and we'll use the import image as planes here option, which I have enabled, and we're going to grab our boat with the alpha transparency enabled. We're going to set this up to shadeless. These things don't import right now. We're going to have to do a little bit of changing here to the settings, but we'll use the add-on to get us started. And here comes the boat. And what we want to do is we want to try to get this. Actually, it probably doesn't really matter how this is parented, as long as it gets parented to it. You may want to set the origin down here just for the sake of transformation and rotation if you wanted to animate it, but I don't think that's going to matter. We're going to take our boat plane here, and we're going to parent it to the first bone. Okay, so the first armature, which is this one right here. So I'm going to select the boat. I'm going to select the armature. I'm going to come up here to Object, and I'm going to hit Parent to Bone. Now, if you notice what happens here as we go along, our image picks up the scale of the X-axis of that bone, but it does not change scale on the Y. So the way we're going to deal with that is we're going to add a constraint to our image. So under that, on the boat plate, we're going to go to the constraints. I'm going to add copy scale, and we want to copy the Y scale only of the second armature. Should we select the bone? There we go. Okay, so we didn't have it selected. All right, so now on the second bone, what we're getting is we're getting Y transformation. So we're getting X and Y transformation, and you can see that it's skewing a little bit because of the perspective. What we want to do is we're going to put this into the right orientation so that it will work right, but it's giving us a bit of a skewed perspective. That's not really a big deal for what we're trying to accomplish here. Actually, I think just putting it in the right orientation will resolve that problem. Let's move this up. in Y space, so it kind of sits at the base right there. Scale it down. Oops. This is something you have to be aware of when you go to scale. Let's turn this off here real quick. When we scale it, we'll want to apply that new scale. I'm going to scale this down smaller. GY. Rotate on the Z-axis a little bit. And that seems about right, so that the base of the boat is kind of at the base of our track. Now this could really sit anywhere on this track. We're just going to put it in the middle for the sake of the tutorial, but you could put it anywhere because it will parent specifically in location to that bottom bone. Now that we've done that, we're going to go to Object and apply our scale that we've changed. And actually I'm going to apply rotation too, just for the sake of consistency. And now we will re-enable our copy scale, and now we should get a pretty good stationary track of this object. So you can see what's going on here. We're getting parallax motion around the boat, but the boat is staying parented to our bone. You see this lifting that's going on? This is what I was talking about. Let's resolve that very quickly. I want to go back here to the first frame, and you can see I have my cursor about where I want the base of the boat to be. What I'm going to do is on my boat, just disable this for a second, I'm going to go to Object, Set Origin, and I'm going to hit Origin to 3D Cursor. So that will set the origin down here, and then this will be the new parent point. So now when I enable my scale here, you'll see that this doesn't float anymore because it's parented at that point to the bone on the bottom. And now we have everything in place. Okay, let's deal with some textures very quickly here. Let's go back to our shader. And you can see it has a shadeless texture on there. Again, I've discovered that we don't really need this shadeless texture. We can just plug that directly in, so I'm just going to get rid of it. And for it has a transparent BSDF enabled there. That's all good. What we want to do is on our material setting over here is we want to set the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend, and then that will get us where we want to be. So if we now look at our boat, and if I turn off all of our peripherals in the scene there, you can see if we go back to the beginning and play it back, our boat is now tracked in. Our card is tracked into the scene pretty well. That's really the basics of the tutorial. We can look a little bit at compositing elements here as well. But that's essentially everything that's going on. Okay, let's add some assets to this to make it look like it's actually in the scene. And we're going to do a little bit of color compositing right here, right in the viewport. On my boat, I'm going to add a color curves. I'm going to put this onto the texture. And the first thing here is that, even before that, let me add another node. I'm going to add another color hue and saturation. I'm going to put that before the curves. And on the hue and saturation, I'm going to take the saturation down to 0.8, desaturate it a little bit. Then I'm going to come over here to my color, and we're going to try to match our color a little bit better. So let's darken it up a little bit. So you can see the rocks are pretty dark in here. Everything's kind of shadowy. And maybe we'll take a little bit of the red out. So it looks a little bit more bluish green. Maybe we'll add a little bit of a contrast curve here. Too dark. But now it's starting to look like an object that actually is in that lighting, in that scene. That looks pretty good. So what we need now is we need some water assets to go around this object so that it looks like it's in place. So I have an interesting technique for that. First thing I'm going to do, though, is save this, and we'll just save this to the desktop for right now. Let's get some water assets. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to go to the movie, the video sequence editor, rather, and come here to video editing. I have another video of water. I also got this from Pixabay. And I noticed the camera does slide a little bit. There's a little bit of a nodal pan, but it's fairly stationary. And what I want to do is I want to try to steal some of these rapid figures here and make my own asset. So I'm going to take this and drop it in. And I'm not going to need the audio, so we'll just get rid of the audio there. I'll just move this down on Y space. So we only need 180 frames of it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create somewhat of a mask here, just a black and white mask for the rapids. And the way we'll do that is I'm going to go to the color settings here and set the saturation all the way to 0. Then I'm going to add to this a curves adjustment. And I'm going to bring the darks down. I'm going to bring it down quite a bit here. Actually, I might take the low end and slide it over so we can get a contrast curve. What I want to get is I want to get anything that's not rapids to be pretty black, pretty dark. I just want to see the rapids here. And I want a little bit of a fall off too. I don't want it all to be white. I want to see a little bit of gray in there, so we can get some contrast and fluid. And this looks pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this image and I'm just going to render out one frame. So I'll just render this from the OpenGL. So I'll click on View and Sequence Render Image. And actually, let me make sure my settings are right here. I want this to be, we'll do 1280 by 720. And that's good enough. Make sure we're up to 100%. So I'll render one image. And we're going to save this image to the desktop for right now. And we're going to open that up in GIMP. So we'll go to the desktop. And we'll open this up inside of our image editor. We're going to create a mask here to mask out the parts of our rapids that we don't want in the shot. So I'm going to add another layer. And this is just a little bit quicker than adding, want it to be transparent, a little bit quicker than masking out right in Blender, because we're just going to paint something on. The camera doesn't move. It's a stationary shot. What we're going to do is we're going to grab our paint tool, our paintbrush tool, and we'll just use the default fall off there. I'm going to increase the size quite a bit. And I'm just going to paint out on a transparent layer anything I don't want. So I don't want any of this stuff up here. Really, I'm just looking for this line right down here, this edge, where you get a little bit of splashing and rapids. Right down there. Leave that on. Paint out this top part up here. And I want to get a little bit of a fall off down here on the edge so that we can kind of mask out this edge over here. So I'm just going to very lightly tap in here. In fact, let me undo those. We'll turn down our opacity quite a bit. We'll just kind of brush over this until we get the right fall off. We don't want a hard edge. We want a soft fall off. So that by the time we get to the edge, it is black. So now we have a mask. I'll just disable that so we can see any spots we missed. That will take care of some of our assets here. Okay, so we have what we want. Let's disable the bottom layer, and I'm going to render this out now. Back, I'll just overwrite my original image. We can close out GIMP. And go back to Blender. And I'm going to import that image now. So we'll go to the desktop and we'll just drop this in. And we'll stretch this out. So now what we've done is we've masked out our rapids. If we hit play, we'll see that we have a nice little water asset there that we can use for compositing. I'm going to take both of these tracks and I'm going to put them into a meta strip. Then I'm going to move this meta strip up one channel. Underneath, I'm going to add a color. So we'll go down to effect strip, or rather color, sorry. And we'll move this down here, stretch it out so that we have that underneath. And then on the meta strip, we're going to add an effect strip for transform. On the transform strip, we're going to rotate, try to get our water to be going downward just so we have better perspective for when we import this. We'll move it up into position so we're not cutting off any edges. That. And if we play this back, this is our asset to work with. Okay, so let's move this up a little bit more. Move it over and move it up. We want to render this out. So we're going to render this out to the desktop. We'll call this Rapids. And I'm going to render it as a movie file. And do this quickly with MP4 settings. Doesn't need to have any alpha. And we'll do perceptually lossless. No audio. And we'll render that out. Now I could render directly from here, or I can just render from my regular render engine. So we'll do that. And you can see what I mean. This is kind of slow by Blender 2.79 standards from the VSE for what we did. We only did a couple effects in there, and it's rendering, about 2 frames per second. So that's a little bit on the slow side compared to 2.79. So I'd probably pop open 2.79 to do this kind of thing right now until we get the video sequencer a little bit more up to par. You don't really need to worry about the sticks and things that are in there. This is just for a little bit of masking effect, a little bit of an overlay effect to give the effect of water coming around our boat. So that's just a neat little technique for creating assets from stock footage. So if you can find some royalty-free stock footage, like from Pixabay, you can create assets using just alpha matte techniques. Take the darks down, take out the saturation, increase the contrast, and create an asset mask from that. And there we have it. One thing we want to do is we want to turn off our render settings going out post-processing to the compositor and the sequencer, because we don't want to render this image. We're just going to leave this right where it's at. We'll go back to our layout, and let's import our assets now. So again, I'm going to go to a file, import image as planes. We'll put it on shadeless because that will matter in a moment here, but we will import our image. You can see that it's in the exact same plane as our boat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to move it up in Z-space so that it's sitting in front of the boat. And I'm going to parent it to the boat. So we're going to take our rapids. I'm going to select the rapids plane and the boat plane. And then we're going to go to Object. We're going to hit Parent, Object. So now wherever the boat goes, the rapids will go to. Now we're going to select our rapids plane. And we're going to set our alpha properly here. We want the blend mode to be blend. And if we come over here, you see again we have our shadeless node. We don't need that. We're just going to take this straight out to the bottom. But we're also going to use the exact same image for the alpha factor. So you can see what's going on right now is that I have the alpha being applied to itself. Now what we want to do is we want to expand out that alpha a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a curves adjustment, so a color curves, RGB curve, to the alpha side. And I'm going to boost it, make it a little bit brighter, so that it expands out and grabs a little bit more of our underlying image. Now if I hit play, you'll see that these rapids are moving with the boat. So it's a matter of getting them to line up appropriately with the water that's around it. I'm going to add a curves adjustment down here, to a color curves adjustment to the image underneath. So this is not the alpha layer, but the underlying layer. We're just trying to try to match the color a little bit. There's a little bit of blue tint in that. So I'm going to take the reds and bring them down. I'll start to make it a little bit bluish, especially around the darker areas. So it'll blend in a little bit better. And then from here, I'm going to select my my image, and I'm going to move it on X and Y space until I get it where I want. I might scale it up quite a bit here, see how big it is. And I might take this and rotate it on the Z axis, move it down on the Y axis, and move it over on the X axis. Try to just line it up here so we get just these little pieces going around the boat. So you see you have a little bit over there. If we hit play now, it's starting to look like some water's coming around the edge. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to move this one over on X space. And I'm actually going to rotate it on Y 180 degrees and scale it down quite a bit. Rotate it. Z axis. And move it down. So you can kind of see what's going on. We're just lining up these assets to give us a little bit of action going on there with the water that looks like it's interacting with our boat. And so it goes from there. So you would just add your assets and parent them to your initial card, and then once you have that, you can render out from there. So now, as a solve in a composite, if we go back to our camera view here again, it looks pretty good. In fact, this looks a little better than the other one because I think I went a little overboard on my assets, but probably just add a couple more water assets to that would do it. This looks pretty good already. However, we can do a little bit better by adding a little bit more camera motion. Now, what we can't do is we can't move this camera. This camera is actually parenting all of our data here in terms of our track. So what we want to do is we're going to select our camera, and we're actually going to duplicate the camera. So we'll select the camera, we'll hit Shift D for duplicate. Then we're going to select the new camera, and then under View, we're going to select Cameras, Set Active Object as Camera. So this will be the rendering camera now. So the original camera is going to be used as a placeholder for our data, but the new camera can do a little bit of movement. Now let me tell you what it can do. It can rotate on any axis, but it cannot move in space. Okay. What we're going to do though to this camera first is we're going to bring in our framing a little bit. So we'll go to the camera settings. And under the focal length, we're going to decrease or increase our focal length rather, so that we have more of a margin to work with. Okay. So now what we can do is we can add a little bit of rotation to this to make it look better. So let's do some animating of the camera. We'll go to the graph editor. And we'll go to the first frame, and I'm going to hit I for insert, rotation. I'm going to go to the last frame, and then I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to hit I, rotation. So we're adding camera rotation keys. And then I'm going to go to my graph editor, and under the object transform for the X rotation, open up the sidebar here, we're going to add a modifier. We're going to add noise. And the noise we're going to scale down to about, scale up to about 12. And we're going to scale the strength here to 0.2 and see what we get. So if we hit play, actually let's do 0.02. So now we get a little bit of a realistic wobble to that camera. And let's go to the Y. We're going to do the same kind of settings. We'll add a noise modifier. We'll set this, instead of 12, we'll set it to 14. So it's slightly different. I'm going to set the strength to 0.02, but I'm going to change the phase, so it's a very different waveform that's driving it. And then we'll go to Z. Same thing again, we'll add another noise. And we're going to set this to 16. Strength to 0.02. And we'll change the phase on that one. So none of these curves line up exactly. And if we go back, we can see our animation. Okay, so this looks a lot more turbulent than what it did before. Let's add a little bit more to this. Let's add a zoom effect. So if we have a zoom effect on there, what we can do is we can add some camera motion blur, and that will help also with kind of blending all this together right from the viewport. So I'm going to go to a frame here, maybe right about here, where I'm going to add a keyframe to this focal length. And then I'm going to go inside. I'm going to set my focal length a little bit lower, actually quite a bit lower, maybe right about here. I'm going to zoom in so we can kind of get up close and personal with our boat. 139, insert keyframe. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, and we have now this focal length for the first part, and then the camera zooms out like someone's taking it on a cell phone. We can see that might be a little drastic. So we'll go to that keyframe very quickly. And let's make this just a little bit less. And replace keyframe. So now we have a little bit of a camera motion here, a zoom that's happening, quick one. Let's also change our rotation a little bit. So once we get out to this frame, we want our rotation to be where it's at. So I'm going to insert for the camera rotation, but I'm going to go back from there to this point and set a new rotation. So we're going to rotate on the x-axis up. So we're looking a little bit more centrally at our boat. Rotate on the y-axis a little bit. I'd even rotate on the z-axis just a little bit to give a little bit of a skewed slant, and I'm going to hit insert rotation. So this is what we have. Go back to the beginning again. So it kind of moves in on the camera and then zooms out. And you can work to make that as realistic as you want. So from there, we're ready to render out. If you have all the components that you want, you can render out and then do some color correction or grading in another session in the video sequence editor or the compositor, whatever the case may be. So just an interesting concept for us to use to parent a bone to 2 points in three-dimensional space in a 3D track, 3D camera move, and then enable, or rather parent a card to that with scale to an extra bone, so that we can have a card sort of parented to a planar track environment at a root point, where we then get parallax motion around the card. So just a new concept for you to try out. Again, we can render from here if we want to. From the viewport, we can render using OpenGL very quickly. We don't get the benefits of our motion blur and all that kind of stuff when we do that, but you could do that. If you want to use Eevee, then you can come up here and render using the regular render output. So just render an image. You can see a little bit slower, not really all that much slower, but you can render quite quickly doing this right from the viewport. So still hacking the viewport, rendering from there. Anyway, hopefully you find this useful and interesting, and hopefully find a use for it in your own work, and I wish you the best of luck and happy blending.